The woman who walked into Dusty Creek, Nevada on the afternoon of September the 3rd, 1882, looked as though she had been swallowed whole by a fire and spat back out by the earth itself, and every soul on the main street stopped what they were doing to stare. Evelyn Garner came in on foot. No horse, no wagon, no carpetbag or trunk or even a small leather satchel swinging at her wrist. She carried nothing, absolutely nothing at all. Her dress, which had once been a deep burgundy, was scorched along the hem and the left sleeve. The fabric curled and blackened like the pages of a burned letter. There was ash in her dark hair, pale gray streaks of it woven through the brown the way frost settles into the cracks of old wood. Her boots were intact but caked in dried red clay and dust, the kind of dust that told a man she had been walking a long distance on unpaved ground. Her face was composed, not blank, not empty, but composed in the deliberate way of a woman who had decided, somewhere along the terrible road that had led her here, that she would not cry in public. Not today. Possibly not ever again. She walked the length of the main street as though she had a destination in mind, though anyone who looked closely enough could see that her eyes moved carefully over the storefronts, reading the painted signs, searching for something she had not yet found. Dusty Creek was not a large town. It had a general store run by a man named Hatch who was missing 2 fingers on his left hand. It had a saloon called the Copper Nail that did moderate business most evenings. It had a barber, a blacksmith, a small church with a leaning steeple, a doctor whose name was Aldridge and whose hands shook slightly before noon, and it had a land office and a boarding house side by side at the far end of the street, sharing a wall and a hitching post. It also had Nelson Finley. Nelson was 31 years old and had lived in Dusty Creek for the better part of 6 years. He had come out from Ohio with a modest inheritance from his father, a man who had made his money in lumber, and had used that money to buy a modest parcel of land on the eastern edge of town, build a small ranch house with 3 rooms and a proper porch, and establish himself as a man of steady and quiet character. He raised cattle, not many, perhaps 40 head, and he kept a small vegetable garden that his neighbor, a Spanish woman named Dolores Ruiz, openly teased him about. He had a reputation in Dusty Creek for being fair, for paying his debts promptly, for never starting a quarrel even when one was aimed at him, and for being, in the careful language of the unmarried women in town, a very good prospect who simply could not be moved toward the altar by any ordinary means. He was standing outside the land office that afternoon speaking with the land agent, a round-faced man named Garfield, about a fence dispute with his eastern neighbor, when Evelyn Garner walked past him on the street. He stopped mid-sentence. It was not that she was beautiful in a way that demanded attention, though she was, in a way that had nothing to do with decoration or ornament and everything to do with the particular dignity of her bearing. It was the ash. It was the hem of that burned dress. It was the specific, unmistakable quality of her stillness, the way a person goes still when they have survived something enormous and are not yet sure the surviving was worth it. Garfield followed Nelson's gaze and then said quietly, "Good Lord. She looks like she walked out of a house fire." Nelson was already moving. He caught up with her just as she reached the front steps of the boarding house, where a sign in the window read "ROOMS available, see Mrs. Park." "Excuse me," Nelson said. Evelyn turned and he saw her eyes for the first time. They were dark, a deep brown that was almost black in the shade of the boarding house awning, and they were steady as anything he had ever looked at. Not afraid, not desperate, not pleading, just steady and very tired. "I don't mean to presume," Nelson said, "but I wanted to ask if you needed any help." She studied him for a moment. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with sandy hair that had been sun-bleached at the temples and a jaw that was perhaps a fraction too square to be considered conventionally handsome, though it gave him a quality of solidity that was its own kind of appeal. He wore a worn but clean work shirt, dark trousers, and boots that had been resoled at least once. He held his hat in his hand, which she noticed. "I am looking for lodging," she said. Her voice was even and clear, with just the faintest roughness at the edges, as though she had been breathing smoke. "But I find myself in a situation where I cannot pay at present." There was no apology in the statement, and no shame. She delivered it the way one delivers a fact about weather or distance. Nelson glanced at the boarding-house window, then back at her. Something in him made a decision so quickly and so completely that he barely noticed it happening. "Mrs. Park's a fair woman," he said, "but she keeps strict accounts. Let me try something else." He reached into his shirt pocket and produced a key on a small ring. It was an ordinary key, iron, slightly worn at the teeth from use. He held it out to her. "I have a spare room at my place," he said, "out on the eastern edge of town. It's not fancy, but it's clean. The roof doesn't leak and there's a proper stove. You can stay there as long as you need to without owing a cent." She looked at the key in his outstretched hand, and then she looked at him again, the kind of looking that takes inventory, that asks questions without speaking them aloud. "You don't know me," she said. "No," he agreed, "I don't. You don't know where I came from or why I look the way I look or what kind of person I am." "No," he said again, "I don't know any of that." A silence held between them on the front steps of the boarding house while the street carried on behind them. A horse being led past, two women talking outside the general store, the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer. Evelyn reached out and took the key. She closed her fingers around it, and for just a fraction of a second something moved in her face, something that was not quite relief but was related to it, something that lived just below the composed surface and pressed briefly against it from the inside before she controlled it back into stillness. "I am Evelyn Garner," she said. "Nelson Finley," he said, and offered his hand, which she shook with a firm, brief grip. He walked her out to the ranch on the eastern edge of town. The evening light came in long and golden over the Nevada scrubland, washing everything in that particular amber that made even the most ordinary landscape look temporary and precious. The ranch house was modest, as he had said, 3 rooms with a low front porch and a vegetable garden to the north side that looked, in the golden light, surprisingly lush. There was a barn 50 yards out and a paddock with 2 horses and a mule visible through the slats. "The spare room is off the kitchen," Nelson said, unlocking the front door and standing aside. "It has its own window. There's a wash basin and I'll bring water from the well." She stepped inside. The main room was clean in the honest way of a man who cleaned because he liked order, not because he was expecting company. There was a stone fireplace with a mantel that held a clock and 2 candle holders, a table with 4 chairs, one of which had a book open face down on the seat, a braided rug, a cast-iron cook-stove. Everything had the look of being well used and well cared for. She found the spare room. It was small but proportionate, a single bed with a clean quilt, a chest of drawers, a washstand, a window that faced east and would catch the morning light. She stood in the doorway of it for a moment. "I need to know one thing," she said, without turning around. Nelson had stopped in the kitchen, giving her space. "What's that? Is there anything expected of me in exchange for this?" She asked it plainly, because a woman alone in the world in 1882 in the American West had learned to ask it plainly, and the asking was not an insult to anyone with good intentions but simply a matter of self-preservation. Nelson was quiet for a moment. She heard him set down the water bucket he had picked up. "No," he said, "there is not. You are a guest, Miss Garner. Nothing more is expected of you than that." She nodded, still not turning around. "Thank you, Mr. Finley. I'll put water on for washing," he said. "And there's leftover beef stew from this morning if you're hungry, which I suspect you are." She was hungry. She had not eaten since the morning of the day before. She turned around and came back to the kitchen table and sat down, and Nelson Finley put a bowl of beef stew on the table in front of her and sliced bread from a half loaf, and did not ask her a single question while she ate. And that quiet kindness was, she would think later, the first crack in the wall she had built around herself over the preceding terrible week. The story of Evelyn Garner was not, at its heart, a story of catastrophe, though catastrophe had certainly had a hand in bringing her to Dusty Creek. It was the story of a woman who had been, for most of her 26 years, trying to find somewhere that felt like hers. She had been born in Missouri, in a small town outside of St. Joseph, to a school-teacher father and a practical, capable mother who made excellent preserves and poor decisions in matters of the heart. Her father, Thomas Garner, had died of fever when Evelyn was 11, leaving behind his books and his pocket watch and a debt to the local bank that took the house with it. Her mother had remarried within 2 years, a man named Carter who was not cruel but was also not warm and who made it clear, in the quiet daily language of a man who had not wanted stepchildren, that the household had a hierarchy and Evelyn was at the bottom of it. She had learned to be self-sufficient early. She had also inherited her father's love of reading, which in a world that did not have much patience for a girl with opinions meant she spent a great deal of time being quietly out of step with her circumstances. At 20, she had married. His name was Robert Delacroix, a farmer's son from a neighboring county who had bright blue eyes and a talent for saying exactly what a person wanted to hear. For a time it was all right. They had a small farm, a 2-room house, and the reasonable bones of an ordinary life. But Robert Delacroix had a weakness for poker and a worse weakness for believing he was better at it than he was, and over 3 years he had dismantled, piece by piece, everything they had built. By the time Evelyn was 24, he had lost the farm. By 25, he had lost what little remained and had gone to work for a man of dubious character in Kansas City, the kind of work that could not be named plainly in polite company. He had also, somewhere along the way, developed the habit of coming home late and angry. She had stayed longer than she should have, as women in her position often did, because leaving required a kind of courage that took time to accumulate. And then, 8 days before she walked into Dusty Creek, the farmhouse they were renting in a small settlement east of Carson City had caught fire in the middle of the night. A lantern knocked from a table, an oil fire that moved faster than anything she had ever seen. He had gotten out. Robert had not. She did not know in the immediate aftermath how to feel about that. She told herself she felt grief because grief was what was appropriate, and there was grief in it, a genuine mourning for the person he had been at the beginning, for the bright blue eyes before the poker tables changed them. But underneath the grief was something she could not name, something that felt uncomfortably like the first breath a person takes after being held underwater for a very long time. She had nothing. The fire had taken everything. She had stood in the yard of the burned farmhouse in the early morning hours, in her nightgown and a coat she had grabbed on the way out, and she had asked herself where in the world she should go. She had no family of consequence to return to. Her mother was dead, had been for 2 years. Her stepfather Carter was alive, but she would not go there. She had a distant cousin in California whose address she could not precisely recall. She had no money except what she had tucked into the coat pocket, $3.60, which she had been keeping private for an occasion such as this. She had walked. She had begged a short ride on a supply wagon. She had walked some more. She had arrived in Carson City, sold the coat for 70 cents to a woman at a second-hand stall, bought bread and dried meat, and then walked southeast on the main road because southeast felt like it pointed away from everything that had gone wrong. She did not have a plan. She had a direction, and she had walked into Dusty Creek on a September afternoon with ash in her hair and nothing in her hands, which was how the world had found her, and how Nelson Finley had found her too. She stayed in the spare room and tried to take up as little space as possible. In the morning she was up before Nelson, which surprised him on the first day when he came to the kitchen to find the stove already lit and coffee already made. She had found flour and bacon in the larder and made a simple breakfast, and she stood aside when he came in as though uncertain whether the presumption was welcome. "You didn't have to do that," he said, but his tone was not reproving, only slightly startled. "I know," she said. "I wanted to be useful." He poured a cup of coffee and sat down at the table, and she sat across from him because he gestured to the chair, and they ate breakfast together with the easy quiet of people who are not yet comfortable enough for conversation, but are past the first awkwardness of proximity. He went to work after breakfast, out to the cattle and the land, and she spent the first day largely inside, sleeping in the middle of the afternoon in a way she had not allowed herself to sleep since before the fire, a deep, still sleep that surprised her with its completeness. In the evening he came in dusty and tired, and she had figured out the stove well enough to make a passable hash from what was in the larder, and when he tasted it he nodded with what appeared to be genuine appreciation. "Good," he said. "I'm a fair cook," she said. "Not exceptional, but fair." "Fair is better than what I manage most days," he said, and there was a slight smile in it, the first one she had seen from him, that appeared briefly and then retired behind his usual composure. On the second day she asked him if he had soap, and whether she could wash her dress, which she had been wearing since the fire, and he showed her the washboard and the tub in the yard and brought her soap without comment, and while her dress dried on the line he lent her, without being asked, a clean shirt that was several sizes too large and a pair of work trousers she had to fold up at the ankles. She caught him almost laughing at the outfit, something that flickered in his eyes and then was subdued. "You can laugh," she said, looking down at herself. "I wasn't laughing," he said. "You were thinking about it." "Perhaps," he allowed. She looked up and found his expression had settled into something between amusement and warmth, and the combination of it was unexpectedly disarming. "My name is Evelyn," she said, because they had been Mr. Finley and Miss Garner for 2 days, and it felt, suddenly, overly formal given that she was standing in his yard wearing his clothes. "If you would like to use it." "Evelyn," he said, trying it out in a way that was careful and deliberate, as though he wanted to make sure he was using it correctly. "And I will call you Nelson," she said. "That's my name," he said. "Good," she said. "Then we understand each other." The first real conversation happened on the third evening. It came about naturally, the way the best conversations do, from a chance remark that led somewhere neither of them had planned to go. She was washing the supper dishes and he was at the table with the open book she had noticed on the first day. It was a collection of surveying principles, dry reading by any measure, and she happened to ask what he was reading, and he told her, and she said with genuine interest that her father had surveyed land for a time before he became a school teacher, and that opened a door. They talked about her father, and then about her childhood in Missouri, and Nelson listened in the careful way of a man who is not listening merely to be polite, but because he is genuinely receiving what is being told to him. He asked questions that demonstrated he had been paying attention to the answers that preceded them. She did not tell him about Robert, not that night. But she did tell him that she had come from difficult circumstances and that she was not going back to them, and he nodded at this as though it was a perfectly complete explanation that required no elaboration. "What will you do?" he asked. Not in the way that meant "what are you doing in my house and when will you leave," but in the way that meant "what do you want for yourself going forward?" She was quiet for a moment, drying a tin cup. "I can teach," she said. "My father taught me well, better than most schoolgirls are taught. I can read, write, do arithmetic and basic geometry. I can speak some French from a book, which probably isn't very useful out here, but teaching is something I have thought about before." "There's a school here," Nelson said. "Small one, only about 20 children. The teacher they had, a man named Briggs, left in the spring and they haven't found a replacement. Mrs. Alcott, who's on the school board along with the Reverend and old man Sturgis, has been asking around for months." Evelyn set down the tin cup. "Is that so?" she said. "It is," Nelson said. "I'm not saying they'd hire you on the spot, but the need is real." She looked at the window over the wash basin, at the darkness outside and the small reflection of the lamp on the glass. "I would need clothes," she said. "Proper ones. I can't go before a school board looking like this. There's a seamstress named Alma Torres in town. She's reasonable in her prices and she does good work." "I don't have money, Nelson." He was quiet for a moment. "I can advance you a small sum. You can pay it back once you're employed." She turned to look at him directly. "Why?" she asked, not suspiciously, genuinely wanting to understand. He thought about it with the same care he brought to his listening. "Because it seems to me," he said slowly, that you are a person of capability who has run into a serious piece of bad luck, and helping a capable person get back on their feet costs very little and matters a great deal. My father told me that once, and I've found it to be true." She held his gaze for a moment and then looked away at the window again. "Your father sounds like he was a good man," she said. "He was," Nelson said. "He had his flaws like anyone. But he was fundamentally a good man." "Mine was too," she said quietly. "Fundamentally." She went to see Mrs. Alcott 2 days later, dressed in a plain but properly fitted gray dress that Alma Tours had altered from an existing garment on short notice and at a fair price. She had scrubbed the last of the ash from her hair and pinned it neatly, and she sat in Mrs. Alcott's small parlor and answered questions about her education and her experience, of which the formal portion was limited but whose informal depth was evident to anyone paying attention. Mrs. Alcott was a sharp-eyed widow of about 55 with an expression that did not readily commit to approval. She asked Evelyn to demonstrate her handwriting, which Evelyn did on a piece of paper Mrs. Alcott provided. She asked Evelyn to solve 3 arithmetic problems, which Evelyn solved correctly and quickly. She asked Evelyn to describe how she would handle a child who refused to learn, and Evelyn's answer patient, specific, rooted in an understanding of why a child might resist rather than simply that they did seem to satisfy something in Mrs. Alcott's estimation. The Reverend, a mild man named Cobb, came in halfway through and asked several questions of his own, mostly concerning Evelyn's character and origins, which she answered honestly and without embellishment. The school board met that same evening, the 3 of them in Reverend Cobb's study, and by the following morning Mrs. Alcott had come to Nelson's door with a message for Evelyn. The position was hers, to begin on the following Monday, at a salary of $22 per month. Evelyn was standing at the kitchen table when Mrs. Alcott delivered this, and when Mrs. Alcott had gone, she stood very still for a moment with her hands flat on the table and her head slightly bowed. And Nelson, who was drinking coffee by the stove, did not say anything, understanding that this was a moment she needed to inhabit privately. Then she straightened up and turned around, and her face was luminous with the kind of relief that can transform a person's whole appearance. $22, she said. "That's a fair wage," Nelson said. "Better than Briggs got from what I recall." "I have a position," she said. The words came out with a slight unsteadiness, the first crack in her composure that she allowed him to see. "I have a way to begin." "You do," he said. She looked at him across the kitchen, and something passed between them in that look, an acknowledgement, quiet and warm, of what it meant to stand at the beginning of a thing after standing so long at an ending. "Thank you, Nelson," she said. "You did it yourself," he said. "I just told you the door was open." She shook her head slightly, meaning, "We both know that is not quite the whole truth." The weeks that followed were the kind of weeks that arranged themselves, in memory, like a string of warm-lit windows seen from a distance. Evelyn began teaching on that Monday, and from the first day it was clear that she had found something that fitted her. The schoolhouse was a single square room with a good south window and 12 wooden desks of varying size, and the 22 children who occupied them ranged from 6 to 14 in age, and in every variety of temperament and ability. There were children from the ranching families and children from the families of tradesmen and miners. There were 3 children who could already read tolerably well and 7 who could not yet manage more than their own names. There was one boy named Hector Ruiz, the son of Nelson's neighbor Dolers, who was 11 years old, very bright, and accustomed to disruption as a social strategy. Within a week, Evelyn had established an orderliness in the classroom that was not harsh but was very clear, the kind of order that comes from genuine authority rather than from threat. Hector Ruiz, who had reduced the last 2 substitute teachers to visible exasperation, found that Evelyn's responses to his disruptions were so thoroughly unflappable and so specifically targeted to his actual intelligence that within 3 days he had stopped bothering and started paying attention, which was, Evelyn understood, what he had wanted all along. Word went around town, as words do in small towns, that the new schoolteacher was excellent. Mrs. Alcott told Reverend Cobb, who told his wife, who told several other wives, and what emerged from this informal telegraph was a warm regard for the woman staying out at Nelson Finley's place that was initially accompanied by the kind of speculative murmuring that small towns do not resist easily. The speculation, in this case, centered on the obvious question of what exactly the arrangement between Evelyn and Nelson was and what it was likely to become. Nelson heard about this through his friend Caleb Ward, a good-humored man of about 35 who ran the livery stable and who had the rare quality of being able to deliver gossip without any malice in it. "People are asking questions," Caleb said one afternoon when Nelson came in with his bay gelding for new shoes. "People generally do," Nelson said, "about you and the schoolteacher." Nelson picked up a piece of straw and examined it. "There's nothing improper about the arrangement," he said. "I know that," Caleb said, "and you know that. I'm just telling you that when a pretty unmarried woman is living at a bachelor's ranch, people are going to have opinions about it." "People can have any opinions they like," Nelson said. Caleb laughed. "Are you saying you haven't thought about her as more than a house guest?" Nelson was quiet for a fraction too long, which Caleb noted with the attention of a man who had known him for 6 years. "I haven't acted on anything," Nelson said, with deliberate precision. Caleb nodded, satisfied by the candor in it. What Nelson had not said, and what was nonetheless true, was that Evelyn Garner had taken up residence in his thinking in the same quiet but total way she had taken up residence in his spare room. It was not simply that she was attractive, though she was, in the strong-featured, undecorated way that he had always found more compelling than prettiness. It was that she had a quality of mind that made conversation with her feel like a specific pleasure rather than a general social obligation. She was direct without being blunt. She was warm without being easy. She had opinions that she stated and was willing to defend, but she listened to counter-opinions with genuine attention rather than impatience. She also had, he had come to understand, a sadness in her that she managed with great discipline. He had seen it in unguarded moments. Once when she was at the east window in the early morning watching the light come in, and once when Dolores Ruiz had come to call and had mentioned, casually, something about the difficulty of being a widow alone, and Evelyn's expression had briefly gone somewhere that was not the kitchen. He did not press. He trusted that she would tell him when she was ready to tell him, or that she would not, and either way the telling was hers to offer or withhold. The moment it shifted happened on a Sunday evening in late October. They had fallen into the habit, naturally, without discussion, the way habits form when two people occupy the same space over time, of sitting on the front porch after supper when the weather allowed it. He would often have a cup of coffee and she would sometimes have tea, and they would sit in the two weathered wooden chairs that had been on the porch since Nelson had built the house, and they would talk or sometimes simply sit without talking, which was its own form of ease. The October evening was cool but not cold, the sky above the scrubland impossibly wide and thick with stars of the kind that only appear when there is no city light for 60 miles. The Nevada desert sky at night was one of the things Nelson had never stopped finding remarkable, no matter how many years he had lived beneath it. Evelyn was looking at the stars. "I want to tell you something," she said. He waited. "About where I came from before." "You don't have to," he said. "I know I don't," she said. "That is why I want to." And she told him. She told him about Missouri and her father dying and her stepfather, and the long quietness of feeling unwanted in her own childhood home. She told him about Robert Delacroix, about the bright blue eyes and the easy promises and the poker tables, and the work in Kansas City, whose nature she described with a careful circumspection that nonetheless made its character plain enough. She told him about the slow dismantling of everything she had worked to build alongside a man who was dismantling himself simultaneously. She told him about the fire. She told it all evenly, in her clear, level voice, without self-pity and without drama. She was not performing her history for him. She was simply delivering it, as you might deliver a document that had been in your keeping for a long time and that you were now ready to release. When she finished, she looked back at the stars. "I'm not telling you any of this to ask for sympathy," she said. "I wanted you to know who you have been living with, who I am." Nelson turned his coffee cup in his hands. "What I'm hearing," he said, after a long enough pause that she knew he had been genuinely considering what to say, "is that you are a woman who survived a considerable amount of difficulty and came out of it with your integrity intact. That's not nothing. That's, in fact, a great deal." She was silent for a moment. "I didn't love him," she said quietly. "By the end, I had stopped loving him a long time before the fire. I stayed because I didn't know where to go and because I kept thinking that the person he'd been at the beginning was still in there somewhere, waiting to come back. He wasn't. He hadn't been for years." "That's not a fault in you," Nelson said. "No," she agreed, "but it was a choice I made and I own it. I'm not asking you to feel sorry for me." "I don't," he said. "I respect you." She turned to look at him, and in the starlight his profile was clear and quiet, and she thought, not for the first time in recent weeks, that Nelson Finley was the most genuinely good man she had ever been in proximity to, and that the quality of that goodness was not the soft, incurious goodness of someone who simply hadn't been tested yet, but the considered, deliberate goodness of a man who had thought about who he wanted to be and had worked toward it. "Why did you give me the key?" she said. "That first day, you truly didn't know anything about me. I might have been anyone." He thought about it. "You had ash in your hair," he said, "and you were carrying nothing, and you asked about a room with the dignity of someone who wasn't asking out of helplessness but out of temporary necessity. There's a difference. I've seen helplessness and I've seen pride in difficult circumstances, and you had the second kind. That told me enough." She looked back at the stars. "That was a considerable risk on your part," she said. "Maybe," he said. "But I have always thought that the cost of getting it wrong when you help someone is usually much lower than the cost of not helping when you should have." A long quiet settled between them, the warm kind. "Nelson," she said. "Yes. I am glad I came to this town." He looked at her profile, the strong line of her jaw and the dark hair against the night sky, and the wanting he had been managing with great care for weeks rose and settled again like a tide. "I'm glad too," he said. November came in with a cold wind off the desert plateau, and with it came several things that changed the shape of daily life in Dusty Creek. The first was the arrival of a railroad survey team from the Central Pacific. 3 men in city clothes who took rooms at Mrs. Park's boarding house and spent their days riding the perimeter of the town on hired horses, making notes in small leather-bound books. Their presence set off a wave of speculation about whether the rail line might be routed through Dusty Creek, which would have meant a significant change in the town's fortunes. Some people were enthusiastic. Others, including a number of the ranching families, were cautious in the way of people who had watched how railroads had changed other towns, not always for the better. Nelson came home on the 3rd evening of the survey team's visit with his brow slightly furrowed, and over supper Evelyn asked him what he was thinking. "They're looking at the land to the north of my eastern parcel," he said. "If they route the line through there, it won't affect my grazing land directly. But it'll change this town, change what it is." "Would that be a bad thing?" Evelyn asked. He considered it. "It would bring more people, more commerce. That's good for some. It would also bring the kinds of trouble that come with rail towns. I've seen it happen." Evelyn refilled his coffee from the pot. "The school would benefit," she said. "More families means more children, more taxes toward the school budget. We barely have enough slates as it is." He looked at her with a slight smile. "You're already thinking about what it would mean for the school." "It's my school," she said, with a simple possessiveness that she had not used before and that he found unexpectedly endearing. "Of course I'm thinking about it." He laughed then, properly, the first time she had heard him laugh fully, a warm and low sound that she tucked away in her memory the way you tuck away a thing you want to be able to find again. The second event of November was more personal in its complications. A man came to the schoolhouse on a Tuesday morning, a man Evelyn did not recognize but who stood in the doorway of the classroom while she was in the middle of a reading lesson, and looked at her with the deliberate attention of someone who had come specifically to find her. He was perhaps 45, thickset, with a broad hat and a coat that had seen considerable wear. He had the red-faced look of a man who had ridden hard in cold weather. He waited until the morning session was over and the children had gone to their midday break before he came to her desk. "Are you the widow Delacroix?" he said. She was very still. "My name is Evelyn Garner," she said. "I use my birth name. But you were married to Robert Delacroix." "I was." He introduced himself as Jeb Harmon, which meant nothing to her, but then he explained that he was the brother of a man to whom Robert had owed a gambling debt at the time of his death, a debt of $60. Evelyn listened to this carefully. "Mr. Harmon," she said, "I had no knowledge of this debt. My husband's gambling debts were numerous and he did not inform me of their particulars." "Be that as it may, ma'am," Harmon said, not unkindly but firmly, "the debt was on Robert Delacroix. Now he's dead, and you're the widow." "The house burned," she said. "The farm was rented. There was no estate." Harmon shifted his weight. "My brother says you were running from something when you came through Carson City." "I was walking away from a burned house," she said flatly. "That is what one does after a house burns." He looked at her with an expression that was not threatening precisely, but was the expression of a man who intended to apply ongoing pressure. "I'll be here in town for a few days," he said. "We can settle this peaceably." "There is nothing to settle," she said. "I do not owe a debt I did not make, and there is no estate from which to pay one in any case. Good day, Mr. Harmon." He left, but she sat at her desk for a long time after the children came back in, maintaining the lesson by the force of professional will, while a cold anger moved through her that had nothing to do with the children, and nothing to do with Dusty Creek, and everything to do with the long shadow that Robert Delacroix continued to cast from beyond his grave. She told Nelson that evening. He listened without interrupting, leaning back in his chair with his arms folded and his expression shifting from attentiveness to a careful, controlled displeasure. "He has no legal claim," Nelson said when she was done. "I know that," she said, "but knowing it doesn't make him go away." "Is he the kind of man who makes trouble when he doesn't get what he wants?" "I don't know him," she said. "I'd never seen him before today." Nelson was quiet for a moment. "I'll speak with Will Dunbar." Will Dunbar was Dusty Creek's deputy sheriff, a capable and straightforward man who had kept reasonable order in the town for 4 years. The sheriff himself, a man named Poole, was based primarily in the county seat 40 miles south and came through Dusty Creek monthly. "You don't need to fight my battles," Evelyn said, with a trace of the independence that was always present in her, the product of years of having learned to manage things herself. "I'm not fighting anything," Nelson said. "I'm going to speak with a lawman about a man who is making questionable claims against a member of this community. That's not fighting, that's sensible." She looked at him for a moment, and then nodded once in acceptance. Nelson spoke with Will Dunbar the following morning, who agreed that Harmon had no legal standing, and told Nelson he would make that clear to Harmon himself. This happened that afternoon. Jeb Harmon came to the schoolhouse once more the following day, not threateningly, but to say, in a tone that had rearranged itself from pressure to something closer to resignation, that he understood the situation was complicated and he would be moving on. He left town on the Thursday morning on the early southbound stage. When Evelyn heard he was gone, she was in the middle of afternoon lessons, and she simply continued the lesson. But when the children were dismissed and the schoolroom was empty, she sat at her desk and let out a long, slow breath that released something she had been holding tightly since Tuesday. She walked home in the late afternoon light. She had begun thinking of Nelson's house as home in a way she registered with a small internal note of surprise, and Nelson was already there, earlier than usual, apparently having heard from Caleb Ward that Harmon had left on the morning stage. He was sitting on the porch. "It's done," she said, coming up the porch steps. "It is," he said. She sat in her usual chair beside him, and the late November light came low and orange across the scrubland. And without thinking about it, without deliberating over it or measuring its implications, she reached across the narrow gap between the two chairs and put her hand over his where it rested on the arm of the chair. He turned his hand under hers so that their palms were together, and they sat like that for a time watching the light change, and neither of them said anything at all, because what needed to be said was being said plainly enough in the simple contact of two palms in the evening air. It was Nelson who spoke first, and what he said was not what she might have expected. "I need to tell you something," he said. She waited. "I am not a man who says things before I mean them," he said. "So I want to say this carefully because I mean it." He paused, and the orange light spread and deepened. "In these 2 months you've been here," he said, "you have become not just someone I'm glad to have around, though that's true. You've become the person I think about when I'm out working, not in a small way. You've become the person whose voice I look forward to in the evening. You've become the reason the house feels different than it did before." He turned to look at her, and his expression was open in a way she had not seen before, the usual composure laid aside with a carefulness that suggested it had taken some effort. "I don't want to presume," he said. "After everything you've been through, the last thing I want is to make you feel obligated or pressured by any of this. The roof over your head has nothing to do with how I feel, and I want you to know that plainly." Evelyn looked at him, and the warmth that had been building in her for weeks, that she had been examining from a careful distance like a person looking at a flame and trying to determine if it was safe to approach, moved toward him now without caution. "Nelson," she said, "I came here with ash in my hair and nothing in my hands, and you gave me a key and a bowl of stew, and you never once made me feel like a burden or an obligation or a charity case. You made me feel like a person. Do you understand how rare that is?" He was very still, listening. "I have spent my adult life being careful about my own feelings," she said, "for very good reasons. But I have been less careful than I intended to be about you, and I have noticed that for some time now." He let out a slow breath. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" he asked, and the question was not coy. It was the honest checking of a man who did not want to misread. "I am saying," she said, "that what you feel I feel also, and I am not frightened of it." He brought her hand, which was still in his, up and held it in both of his and looked at it for a moment in the orange light and then looked up at her. "Good," he said, which was, from Nelson Finley, the equivalent of a poem. She laughed, and the laugh was the freest sound she had made since she arrived, without any of the careful management that had characterized her expression for so long, and it transformed her face completely. And Nelson Finley looked at her laughing in the last of the November light, and thought that he had never in his life felt so fortunate. The courtship that followed was conducted in the full view of Dusty Creek, which noticed it, approved of it collectively, and discussed it at length in the general store, the saloon, the church, and Dolores Ruiz's kitchen. Dolores Ruiz was particularly pleased, because she had been telling Nelson for 4 years that he was too much alone, and that aloneness was bad for the temperament, and she liked to be right. "She is a good woman," Dolores told her son Hector, who agreed because Miss Garner was the best teacher he had ever had, a fact he acknowledged with the grudging sincerity of an 11-year-old who found sincerity uncomfortable. Nelson and Evelyn went to the church social in December, arriving together, which was noted. He brought her wildflowers he found growing in the protected lee of a rock formation to the south of the ranch, which were small and unremarkable flowers, but which she put in a tin cup of water on the kitchen windowsill and left there until they were thoroughly dead, long past the point when most people would have thrown them away. He taught her to ride properly, because the horse she had borrowed from Dolores for the occasional errand was patient, but she had not ridden since childhood and her technique was uncertain. He was a patient teacher, specific and calm, and she was a diligent student, and within 3 weeks she was comfortable enough to accompany him on the longer rides around the property that he took on Sunday afternoons. The Nevada winter was not harsh by Eastern standards, but it was cold and clear, and the desert landscape in winter had a quality of spareness that she came to love. The way the scrub sage stood gray-green against the pale soil, the way the light came in so clean and direct without the softening effect of humidity, the enormous pale blue of the winter sky. She had stopped grieving Robert Delacroix by now, or rather she had completed the portion of grieving that was necessary. She had processed the sadness and the waste and the loss of the years she would not get back, and she had set it down. It did not leave her entirely, as loss does not, but it had taken its proper size, which was much smaller than it had occupied for months. What she found in its place was a lightness she had not felt in years, a quality of mourning she had forgotten was possible. Nelson took her to the Christmas Eve service at the church, and afterward they walked home in the cold, clear night, the stars overhead enormous and brilliant, the desert quiet in the particular way of very cold nights, and halfway along the road he reached over and took her gloved hand in his, and she leaned her shoulder into his arm, and they walked home like that through the starlit cold, and when they reached the porch he stopped and turned to face her. "Evelyn," he said. "Nelson," she said. He kissed her, and it was the kind of kiss that had been building for months, and that, when it finally arrived, felt less like a beginning than like a recognition. Like two people finally saying plainly something they had been saying obliquely for a very long time. She kissed him back with her whole attention, both hands against the front of his coat, and when they drew apart the cold air moved between them, and she looked up at him in the starlight and said, with a quiet frankness that was entirely her own, "I have been wanting to do that for quite some time." "As have I," he said, and kissed her again. The new year came in cold and quiet, and full of a quality of beginning that Evelyn felt in her chest like a sustained note. The railroad survey team had submitted their report, and the word that came back through various channels was that the Central Pacific intended to route a spur line through a corridor approximately 8 miles to the west of Dusty Creek, which was close enough to affect the town's commerce and growth without bisecting it. There would be a small depot town established along the spur, and Dusty Creek would service it through a connecting road. This was, on balance, considered good news growth without the most disruptive consequences of a rail town directly imposed. The school gained 4 new pupils by February, as 2 new families arrived in town, in advance of the construction work. Evelyn requested additional funding from the school board, which Mrs. Alcott wrestled from the town budget with her considerable will and not inconsiderable stubbornness, and Evelyn used it to buy 8 new McGuffey's readers, 2 new arithmetic books, and a proper map of the United States territories that she hung on the wall behind the teacher's desk, where it became the object of daily study for several students who had previously had no clear idea where Nevada stood in relation to the rest of the country. Hector Ruiz, who was now 12 and had developed an intense interest in geography, could place every territory and state on that map from memory by March, and did so upon request with a composure that had ceased to be disruptive and had become something closer to scholarly. Nelson watched Evelyn teach once, standing in the back of the schoolroom with Mrs. Alcott's permission on a Friday afternoon when Evelyn had organized a geography competition that had the children divided into 2 teams and thoroughly engaged. He stood against the back wall and watched her manage 26 children. The count had grown with the easy authority of someone who had found the precise expression of her capabilities, and he felt something in his chest that was both pride and a deeper, more personal thing, that he was now no longer trying to manage at arm's length. He had been thinking about a particular conversation for several weeks. He asked her to walk with him on a Saturday in April when the desert had its brief and vivid spring, the scrubland producing its small flowers, and the sky softening to a blue that was almost warm. They walked south from the ranch house, following the line of a dry creek bed that in a wet spring sometimes ran with water and now showed only its pale, smooth-stoned ghost. He had thought a great deal about how to say what he wanted to say, and in the end he discarded the prepared approach entirely and said it the way he said most things, directly and without excess. "I would like to marry you, Evelyn," he said. She stopped walking. He stopped too, facing her on the pale bank of the dry creek, the spring light falling across her, her dark hair in its usual near arrangement, her dark eyes finding him. "I know that marriage is a thing you have reason to be cautious about," he said. "I know what your experience of it was, and I would never minimize that. What I am telling you is that I am not Robert Delacroix, and I will never be, and that I intend to spend my life making sure you know the difference every day." She was looking at him with the full, attentive look that meant she was genuinely hearing him. "I want to build something with you," he said. "Not just share a house, build something real, you and I here in this place." "Nelson," she said. He waited. She reached out and put her hand against his jaw, the way she sometimes did when she wanted him to understand that she was entirely present. "The answer is yes," she said, "without reservation." His expression, which had been very controlled during the asking, shifted then into something simpler and more complete than she had ever seen on him, a happiness that had nowhere to hide and did not try to. He brought her hand from his jaw to his lips, and she laughed again, that free and unguarded laugh, and the spring desert received it with indifference and absolute beauty. They were married on the first Saturday of May, 1883, in the small church with the leaning steeple, by Reverend Cobb, with the full attendance of Dusty Creek and the considerable approval of every soul in it. Dolores Ruiz wept openly and described this later as entirely appropriate. Caleb Ward was best man and arrived 5 minutes late from some stable emergency that he refused to describe in detail. Mrs. Alcott sat in the front row on the groom's side and wore a hat that was the finest thing anyone in Dusty Creek had seen in recent memory, and her expression throughout the ceremony was one of serene satisfaction, which was, for Mrs. Alcott, the equivalent of weeping. Alma Torres had made Evelyn's dress, a pale ivory with simple, clean lines and a modest train, without embellishment except at the wrists, where there was a 1/4 inch of good lace. Evelyn had asked for something she could eventually take apart and make into other useful garments, because she was practical by nature and proud of it, and Alma had made her something that also happened to be, within the design constraints, genuinely beautiful. Nelson stood at the front of the church when she came in on the arm of Deputy Dunbar, who had volunteered for the office because she had no male relatives to provide it, and the look on Nelson's face when he saw her was not the look of a man performing an expected emotion for public consumption. It was the specific, private look of a man who sees the thing he wants most clearly before him and understands, fully, the weight of the moment. She walked up the aisle and took his hand, and they stood facing each other, and Reverend Cobb conducted the service in his mild and competent way. And when Nelson said, "I do," he said it in the same voice he used for everything important, clear, deliberate, and entirely meaning it. And when Evelyn said it, she said it with the same directness that had characterized her since the moment she had walked into this town and taken a key from a stranger's hand without a flinch. The reception was held at the back of the general store, where Hatch had cleared space and Dolores had organized the food in the way of a woman who believes that love and meals are not separate categories. There was dancing to a fiddle player named Preston who was better than you would expect for so small a town, and Nelson danced, which surprised several people who had never seen him dance, adequately and with evident enjoyment. He danced with Evelyn for 3 songs consecutively at one point, which made Dolores say something to Caleb Ward that made Caleb laugh. Late in the evening, when the party had thinned to its core and the fiddle had gone quiet and the desert night was coming in through the open back door with its clean cold, Evelyn stood beside Nelson with her hand through his arm, looking out at the stars. "I have been trying to think," she said, "of a word for what this is." "What this is," he said. This day, this town, she paused, the feeling of it. He was quiet, thinking with her. Home, she said, finally. I think the word is home. He covered her hand with his, warm and sure. Yes, he said, that's the word. The summer of 1883 was warm and dry, as Nevada summers were, and life on the ranch took on the rhythmic quality of a thing that has found its proper shape. Evelyn continued teaching through the summer, because the school board had agreed to a year-round session 4 days a week, which she had proposed, and which had been accepted partly on the merits, and partly because Mrs. Alcott had decided it was a good idea. Nelson's cattle herd had grown modestly. He had purchased 12 additional head in the spring from a rancher to the north who was retiring, which brought his total to 54, and with Evelyn's income from the school contributing steadily to the household, they were comfortable in the way of people who have enough and know it. They argued occasionally, as any two people who share a life will, and their arguments had the particular character of two people who are both direct and both intelligent, which meant they were generally brief, heated at their peak, and fully resolved at their end. They did not leave things unfinished. This was, by the natural temperament of each of them, a shared habit, and it served them well. In October of 1883, Evelyn told Nelson, on a Sunday morning while they were still drinking coffee at the kitchen table with the early light coming through the east window, that she believed she was expecting a child. She told him with the same directness with which she told him everything, watching his face while she said it. He was very still for a moment. Then he set down his coffee cup and reached across the table and took her face in both his hands with a gentleness that was entirely at odds with his usual restraint, and he looked at her for a long moment without speaking. "Are you well?" He said. "How do you feel?" "Queasy in the mornings," she said, "but otherwise well." He nodded slowly, processing. "We should tell Dr. Aldridge," he said. "His hands shake before noon," she reminded him. "After noon, then," he said, and the slight smile came and went. She put her hands over his where they rested against her face. "Nelson, are you happy about it?" He looked at her, and his expression was everything. "I am the happiest I have ever been about anything," he said, with the simple conviction of a man who does not say things he does not mean. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead against his, and they stayed like that in the morning light until the coffee went cold. The pregnancy proceeded in good health, and Dr. Aldridge, consulted after noon on a Thursday, confirmed it with a brisk competence that suggested his shaking hands were not an impediment to his professional judgment. He told Evelyn she was strong, which she knew, and that she should eat well, which she did, and that she should rest more than she probably would, which proved to be accurate. She continued teaching through her 7th month, which caused some conversation among the more conservative members of the Dusty Creek community, but which Mrs. Alcott shut down with a brevity and authority that were both impressive. The school had 100% attendance in October, partly because winter was coming and partly because Miss Garner, who was now Mrs. Finley but who the children continued to call Miss Garner out of habit and affection, was teaching them to put on plays, the first theatrical productions Dusty Creek had hosted in several years. The play was an abbreviated version of a story from Greek mythology that Evelyn had adapted for 12-year-olds, and Hector Ruiz played the lead with a seriousness that reduced his mother to proud tears in the audience, which embarrassed him considerably and which he privately treasured. The child arrived on a February morning in 1884, with a winter storm moving across the plateau to the north and the wood stove in the bedroom going full and hot, and Dr. Aldridge present and capable, his hands entirely steady because it was 2 in the afternoon. It was a boy, a healthy, emphatic boy with dark hair like his mother and a scowl like his father when Nelson was concentrating on something. They named him Thomas, after Evelyn's father. Nelson held him in the first hour with the careful, wondering attention of a man encountering something entirely outside his previous experience, and Evelyn watched Nelson hold their son and felt something complete in her that she had not known was incomplete, a piece of herself that had been looking for a place to land for 28 years and had, at last, found it. Thomas Finley, Nelson said, trying the name. Thomas William Finley, Evelyn said, because she had decided to add Nelson's father's name as a middle name, a decision she had made without telling him and now delivered as a finished fact. Nelson looked at her. "You're certain," he said. "I am," she said. "Your father gave you your principles, and your principles are what brought this child into the world in the circumstances he's coming into. He deserves the name." Nelson looked back at the boy, and there was something in his expression that Evelyn catalogued carefully, a depth of feeling he rarely displayed, moving in him plainly. "Thank you," he said quietly, and it covered more than just the name. Thomas William Finley grew in the way of a well-loved and well-fed child, with great speed and considerable noise. He was walking by 10 months and talking in full if rudimentary sentences by 14 months, which Evelyn attributed to the fact that she talked to him constantly, narrating the world around him with the instinct of a teacher, and which Nelson attributed to the fact that their son had simply inherited Evelyn's complete inability to remain silent when there was something to be communicated. He was a cheerful child by nature, though firm in his preferences, which was also from both parents. He followed Nelson around the ranch with the intense investigative focus of a small person learning how everything in the world operates. He sat on Evelyn's lap in the evenings while she read aloud, first picture books, and then, as he grew, stories of increasing complexity, and his attention span for a good story was, from very early, extraordinary. Dusty Creek grew around them in the years that followed. The spur line brought more settlers, more families, more commerce. Alma Tor's seamstress shop expanded into a proper dry goods component. Caleb Ward's livery grew a second building. Mrs. Park's boarding house added 4 rooms. A second saloon opened, which Will Dunbar supervised with a watchful eye and a firm hand. The school required a second teacher by 1886, and Evelyn hired a young woman named Josephine McAllister, who had come from Sacramento with a teaching certificate and a quiet determination that Evelyn recognized as a fellow traveler of the spirit. Josephine taught the younger grades while Evelyn managed the older students and the overall administration of what had grown from a single room to a 2-room building with 43 pupils. Nelson's ranch had also grown. By 1886, he ran 90 head of cattle on an expanded parcel he had purchased from a neighbor who had left for California, and he had hired 2 hands, brothers named Guillermo and Arturo Castillo, who were skilled and reliable. The ranch house had been expanded as well, 2 new rooms added to the back, a larger kitchen, and a proper second bedroom for Thomas that he decorated, at the age of 2, by drawing on the wall in charcoal in a way that Evelyn found less objectionable than Nelson expected, because the drawings were, in their rough and earnest way, rather expressive. She framed the best one in a piece of simple pine and hung it in the kitchen, which caused Nelson to look at it for a long moment, and then at Evelyn and then back at it, with an expression that encompassed both amusement and the resigned love of a man who has learned when to surrender gracefully. In the spring of 1886, Hector Ruiz, who was now 15 and had been Evelyn's student for 3 years before outgrowing the school's curriculum, told Evelyn that he intended to become a schoolteacher himself one day. She looked at him, tall now, with his mother's bright eyes and his own particular quality of contained intelligence, and she thought of herself at 15, in a house where she was not wanted, with books that were her only reliable company. "You will be excellent at it," she said, "and I will write you the finest letter of recommendation in the territory when the time comes." He received this with his customary composure, and then, with the expression of a boy trying to maintain dignity while experiencing something that threatened it, he nodded once and said, "Thank you, Mrs. Finley," and left the schoolroom at a pace that was slightly too fast for full composure. She told Nelson about it that evening, and he smiled the full, warm smile that she still found, 4 years into their marriage, as good as it had ever been. "You're going to produce better people than this town can hold," he said. They'll go out into the territory and change things. That's the idea, she said. He reached across the supper table and touched her hand briefly, the way he did sometimes in the middle of ordinary moments, as if wanting to verify that the ordinary moment was real. Thomas, who was 2 and sitting in his small chair at the end of the table with a bowl of mashed sweet potato and the serious concentration of a person engaged in important work, looked up at his parents holding hands and said, with the calm authority of a very small man who considers himself an equal participant in all family activities, "Good." Nelson looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked at Nelson. They both looked at Thomas. "He's right," Nelson said. "He generally is," Evelyn said. In the summer of 1887, Evelyn and Nelson sat on the front porch one evening in the position that was still their preferred position, side by side in the 2 weathered chairs, though the chairs had been replaced twice since the original ones had finally given out. Thomas was inside asleep, having spent the day following Guillermo around the paddock and learning, with intense seriousness, the names of all the horses. The Nevada sky was in full summer mode, the stars so thick above the dark desert that they seemed to press down slightly, the air warm and still with the desert night coming on. Nelson had his coffee. Evelyn had her tea. This had not changed in 5 years. "I have been thinking," Evelyn said. "About what?" Nelson said. "About everything," she said. "About what it looks like from here, all of it." He waited, understanding that she was choosing her words in the careful way she sometimes did when the thing she was saying mattered a great deal. "When I walked into this town," she said, "I had ash in my hair and nothing in my hands. I had $3.60 in a coat I'd already sold. I had the dress on my back which was burned. I had no plan and no destination and no one in the world expecting me anywhere." She paused. The night moved slightly, a warm current in the still air. "And you handed me a key," she said. Without a single question. He was quiet for a moment. "I remember," he said. "Do you know what that meant?" she said. "I think I understand something of it," he said. "It meant," she said, "that there was at least one person in the world who was willing to see past the ash and the empty hands to the person underneath, without proof of who I was, without a history or a reference or a recommendation. Just, here is a key, here is a room, here is a bowl of stew, you are welcome here." Her voice was entirely steady, because she had mastered steady, but underneath the steadiness was the full depth of what she was saying. "I spent years feeling like I was a person without a place in the world," she said, "like I was existing in the margins of other people's lives, and then I came here and I walked into yours and you just made room, without hesitation." Nelson set down his coffee cup. "Evelyn," he said. "I'm not finished," she said, with a faint, warm humor in it. He waited. "I have a home," she said. "I have work that is mine and that I am good at. I have a son who will do remarkable things if we do our part correctly, and I believe we will. I have this town, which is full of people I know by name and who know me. And I have you," she paused, "which is more than I ever thought I would have. More than I thought I deserved for a very long time." He turned to look at her in the starlight, and the look on his face was the open, full expression that she had first seen on the dry creek bank when she said yes, and that she saw in full at intervals of significance and in small glimpses at all the ordinary moments between. "You deserve everything you have," he said, "and more." "Maybe," she said, "but this is enough. This is more than enough. This is everything." He reached over and took her hand, the same way he had on that November evening years ago when she had first reached for him, palm against palm, fingers closing. "I loved you," he said, "from somewhere very close to the beginning." "I know," she said. "So did I. I didn't want to rush you." "You didn't," she said. "You waited exactly the right amount of time." "How did I know how long the right amount was?" She smiled at the stars. "Because you pay attention. You always have. It's what you do." He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles in the quiet way of a man who does not need an audience for tenderness. "I would give you that key again," he said. "Every time, 1,000 times over." She looked at him, and in her dark eyes in the starlight was something that required no translation, that had nothing to do with language or articulation, and everything to do with a particular species of certainty that, once felt, becomes the ground beneath a person's feet. "I know you would," she said. "That is exactly why I took it." The years continued to turn in Dusty Creek, Nevada, in the good way that years turn when they are built on solid ground. In the autumn of 1888, Evelyn and Nelson's second child arrived, another boy, robust and loud, who they named James Nelson Finley, the middle name chosen by Thomas, who had recently developed a strong opinion about the importance of names and who felt, with the convictions of a 4-year-old who had been well educated by his mother, that his father's name should be in there somewhere. James was fair where Thomas was dark, easy-tempered where Thomas was earnest, and from his first months displayed an affinity for animals that led to the acquisition, by his 3rd birthday, of a small brown dog named Copper who became his constant companion, and who Evelyn allowed in the house with only moderate protest. Thomas, at 6, took his position as elder brother with immense seriousness and taught James the names of the states and territories from the framed map on the kitchen wall before James could entirely say them, which meant James's first vocabulary was geographically comprehensive if phonetically approximate. Nelson watched his 2 sons with the steady, warm attention he brought to everything important, and in the evenings he sometimes sat on the porch with Evelyn, and they talked about the boys the way people talk about the best and most interesting thing in their lives, with a mixture of wonder and amusement, and a love that had no bottom to it. Dolores Ruiz became, over these years, a close friend to Evelyn in the way that neighbor women become close friends when there is genuine mutual respect and a shared understanding of what it means to work hard and to raise children, and to maintain a life in a place where nothing is given freely, but much can be built. They ate supper together regularly, the 2 families around the larger table that Nelson had built when it became clear that 4 people required more room than the original one had provided. Hector, who was growing toward adulthood with his mother's brightness and his own particular gravity, spent many of these suppers telling Thomas and later James about geography and history, with the natural authority of a young person who has recently discovered that they love to teach. Evelyn watched this with a private satisfaction that was almost circular in its completeness. The school continued to grow. By 1889, it served 61 children and had 3 teachers, and the town had begun discussing the construction of a proper schoolhouse to replace the 2-room building that was now straining at its sides. Mrs. Alcott, who was now nearly 70 and had not lost a single degree of her administrative force, pushed the town council for the budget with a persistence that was entirely effective. And by 1890, the new schoolhouse was built 4 rooms, a proper entry hall, windows on 3 sides, and a small office for the head teacher that Evelyn occupied with the quiet satisfaction of a person who has arrived, definitively, where they were meant to be. On the day the new schoolhouse opened, Nelson was there with Thomas and James, and he stood in the back of the main room while the children and their parents gathered, and he watched Evelyn stand at the front of the room and speak about what a school was for, about what it meant to have a place in the world where a person was measured by what they learned and what they contributed rather than by who they came from, and her voice was clear and warm and absolutely certain of what it was saying. He had heard her speak in public before, at town meetings, at school events, at the church socials where she had become a person of real standing and regarded opinion. She was always good. But on this particular morning, in this particular room that was both hers and the town's, she was extraordinary. Thomas, standing beside his father in the back, tugged Nelson's sleeve. "Papa," he said in his 6-year-old stage whisper. "Yes," Nelson said quietly. "Mama is the smartest person in Dusty Creek," Thomas said, with the uncomplicated conviction of someone stating an obvious fact. Nelson looked down at his son, and then across the room at his wife, who was speaking with both hands and whose eyes were lit with the particular light that came when she was fully in her element. "Yes," he said, "she is." And they stood there together, father and son, in the back of the room their wife and mother had built, and they listened to her voice fill the space she had claimed from nothing but the willingness of one person to give her a chance, and the extraordinary tenacity of a woman who knew what to do with it. Life in Dusty Creek continued to right itself in the manner of things that are good, not without difficulty, because nothing real is without difficulty, but with a fundamental rightness that held through the difficulties and made them manageable and even, in some cases, illuminating. There were years of poor cattle prices that required careful management and the kind of frugality that is honorable rather than desperate. There was a drought in 1891 that dried the pasture grass brown and required Nelson to move the herd to lease land to the north for a season, which meant he was away from the ranch for long stretches, and Evelyn managed everything at home with the competence that had always been hers, and that the years had deepened rather than diminished. There was the winter of 1892 when James had a fever that kept them both at his bedside for 4 nights, and the slow, enormous relief when it broke on the 5th morning and he looked up at them with his fair, sweaty face and asked, in a raspy voice, if Copper was all right. "The dog is fine," Nelson said, his voice roughened with days of no sleep and considerable fear. "Good," James said, and went back to sleep. Evelyn gripped Nelson's hand in the dim light of the children's room, and they leaned on each other with the whole weight of the preceding 4 days, and he put his arm around her, and she pressed her face against his shoulder, and they were both, briefly, something other than strong, and then they were strong again. There were also the good years, the accumulations of ordinary good, the evenings on the porch, the Sunday rides across the desert with the boys, the school Christmas plays that grew more ambitious every year, the satisfaction of a well-managed herd coming through a good autumn, the pleasure of a meal around a full table with people who were loved. By 1893, Thomas was 9 years old and had read every book in the small lending library that Evelyn had established in the school, and she was writing letters to a bookseller in San Francisco on his behalf. James was 5 and had decided that he was going to be a rancher and manage horses, a decision he held with a stability unusual for his age, and which Nelson regarded with a complex mixture of pride and the hope that James might also read books, which James was working toward. In the evenings, Nelson and Evelyn still sat on the porch when the season allowed, and they still talked about everything, and they still sat in the particular comfortable silence of 2 people who have nothing to prove to each other and nothing to hide from each other, and who have found, in the proximity of the other's presence, the specific peace that is the best thing a long love can produce. One September evening, 9 years to the month since a woman with ash in her hair had walked into Dusty Creek carrying nothing, Nelson brought 2 cups of coffee to the porch and handed Evelyn hers and sat in his chair beside her, and they looked out at the desert going gold and orange in the late light. "I have been thinking," Nelson said, which was unusual enough as an opening that Evelyn looked at him. "What have you been thinking about?" she asked. "About the fact that it has been 9 years," he said. "Since you walked into town." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the same golden landscape. 9 years, she repeated. "How does it seem to you?" he asked. "From the inside of it." She thought about this with the genuine care she gave to everything he asked her seriously. "It seems," she said slowly, "like 2 different lives that also somehow make one continuous thing. There was before, which was real and happened and made me who I am. And then there is this, which has been everything I didn't know how to imagine back then." She looked at him. "I didn't know when I came here that this was possible for me. I had accepted, somewhere in the part of myself that had been managing on its own for so long, that this kind of life was something that happened to other people, people with easier histories, people who hadn't made the choices I'd made. And now," he said. "And now I know that the choices didn't disqualify me," she said. "They were just the road, they were how I got here." He nodded slowly. "The ash," he said. "The ash," she agreed, "and the empty hands, and the man who gave me a key without a single question and let me figure out the rest myself." He looked at her and she looked back, and between them was the full, accumulated weight of 9 years of a shared life. The mornings and the suppers and the arguments and the laughter and the children and the silences and the 100,000 small moments that make up the substance of a real love. "I would do it again," he said. She smiled at him, slow and warm. "I know," she said. "I have known that from the beginning. That is what the key meant, not just the room or the roof or the soup, though all of those things mattered. What the key meant was that you were the kind of person who does not require a person to prove themselves before extending trust. You gave trust first and let the proof come after. That is very rare." He looked at his coffee cup. "It shouldn't be," he said. "No," she agreed. "It shouldn't be, but it is. And so it matters more when you find it." The evening light turned from gold to amber, and then to the deep, translucent orange that came just before the stars appeared over the Nevada desert, and Dusty Creek settled into its evening smoke rising from the chimneys of the houses along the main street. The sound of someone's supper on a stove, a horse in a stable making its slow evening sounds, somewhere a child calling out, and behind them in the house they had built and expanded and filled with a life, 2 boys moving through the rooms with the specific, comfortable sounds of children who are home and know it. Evelyn reached over and took Nelson's hand. He turned his palm up and received hers. They sat like that in the last light of the September evening, husband and wife, on the porch of the house on the eastern edge of Dusty Creek, Nevada, in the year 1891, with everything behind them that had brought them here and everything ahead of them still to be lived, and the desert spread out before them in its indifferent and magnificent silence, and above it the stars were beginning, one by one, to come out. Inside, Thomas called out for his mother in the voice of a boy who needed help with a word in a book. Evelyn stood up from her chair, squeezing Nelson's hand once before releasing it. "Coming," she called back, and went inside. Nelson sat for another moment in the evening air, the coffee warm in his hands, looking out at the desert sky. He thought of a gray September afternoon 5 years back. A woman walking the main street of Dusty Creek with ash in her hair and nothing in her hands, and a quality of bearing that had stopped him mid-sentence. A key on an iron ring, slightly worn at the teeth from use. The moment she had closed her fingers around it, and the thing that had moved in her face, not quite relief, but related to it, pressing briefly against the composed surface from inside. He thought of what she had built since then, what they had built together, what Thomas and James would carry into the future of it without ever having to know what it had cost to make it possible. He thought of his father saying, "The cost of getting it wrong when you help someone is usually much lower than the cost of not helping when you should have." He looked up at the first stars appearing in the deepening blue above the Nevada desert. In the kitchen behind him, he could hear Evelyn's voice reading something aloud to Thomas, the clear and certain sound of it coming through the open door, and James's voice asking a question about Copper's supper, and the ordinary, irreplaceable music of a house that is wholly and truly inhabited by people who belong to it and to each other. Nelson Finley finished his coffee. He set the cup on the porch rail. He got up and went inside, to where everything he had ever wanted was waiting for him in a lamplit kitchen, with a map on the wall and 2 boys who would grow into good men, and a woman who had walked out of the ashes of one life into the beginning of another, and who had chosen, every day since, to keep choosing the life she had found here. The door closed behind him. The stars came out over Dusty Creek, Nevada, thick and brilliant and indifferent and beautiful, the same stars that had always been there, the same stars that would always be, and below them the town went on in its small and earnest and enormously human way, and the house on the eastern edge of it held its light against the dark like a promise kept.